This is our 18th session, and we've covered an awful lot.
It's been pure pleasure working with all of you and all of our teams. This week, we're going to be providing a summary and overview with a few vignettes. As we go through all these various topics, it would be so important for you to self-assess. Reflect for a minute on how comfortable you feel, how much you feel you learned these, how much you achieved some degree of competence in these, and which ones remain for you to continue to work on. Now, we're all working on everything all the time, but sometimes there are certain ones that actually we did not reach a level of competence or even understanding of. And so the whole process today is one of self-assessment, in which you will identify which of these areas are particularly targeted for your first round of attention in practice and perhaps in follow-up work to look up some of the resources, which many of which will still be available to you. To review, beginning from the beginning, competency-based supervision is a meta-theoretical approach, and it explicitly identifies the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are occurring within the supervision process, and these comprise clinical competencies, and it informs our learning and our evaluation and our supervision practice. They meet particular criterion reference standards, and each of our professions have those, as well as the regulations. And each of our professions has regulations, and our states and our registration boards have their own regulations, and sensitive to the local clinical setting. Competency-based supervision is one model of supervision, and it's meta-theoretical. So if you have other models of clinical supervision, of course, those are okay as well. The supervision contract is an informed consent agreement in which there's clarity. And we know that supervisees thrive upon clarity. They love to know what the expectations are for supervision, with clarity about exactly how to meet those and what the setting requirements are. So we have models for supervision contracts that have been discussed and that are available. It's been an important part of structuring the relationship. We have infused multicultural competence and multicultural supervision throughout by presenting several models of multicultural supervision, but more importantly, communicating a sense of cultural humility, which is an accurate perception of our own and of others' perspectives on every phenomena, and incorporating a respectful process into supervision and into clinical work, modeling this through our attitudes and our behavior and our openness to feedback, whether it be from our supervisees or from our clients. And these are essential components. Some of the words to describe this are open, non-defensive, thoughtful, reflective. So we all have to be thoughtful, and incumbent upon us to be thoughtful about our own cultural identities and the impact of our privilege and of our oppression and of our clients and of our supervisees as well. This is not a wholesale invitation to go digging into our supervisees' backgrounds, but to be thoughtful that we come from a position of great privilege simply by being a supervisor, and we hold tremendous power over our supervisees.
For different interventions that you can use as a supervisor, we've also talked about different responsibilities like gatekeeping. And an effective relationship with the supervisee is really foundational to accomplishing any of those. And so we spent some time talking about alliances, which is another frame for relationships. And we talked particularly about Borden's notion of the alliance, which is that the supervisor and supervisee, or therapist and client, agree on what they're doing together. That's what their tasks are and what their goals. And in the context of that, they develop a bond that really undergirds everything that they do together, and that involves things like trust that is so important. alliances fluctuate. And so we also had a unit in which we talked specifically about alliance ruptures or strains and how they occur, what they are, and how to repair them. So we talked about, for example, that alliance ruptures can take the form of either withdrawal, that the supervisee pulls back, or is more confrontive. And in some ways, the withdrawal ruptures are more difficult to address because often they're not as apparent to the supervisor. And then we talked about how to address those and strategies such as metacommunication.
The critical supervisor skill is to understand how to identify and to repair supervisory alliances. And this serves as a model for our supervisees, for their clinical work, and for their training experience. Very few supervisees report that they have ever had any kind of relationship repair during supervision, even though there are high levels of conflict or disagreement. We've discussed parallel processes and how, in fact, these can be downward or upward, in fact, emanating either from the client or from the supervisor and going all the way down to the client. And these are phenomena where, in fact, particular emotional processes or processes in general occur, and they're powerful, and they reverberate through the entire set of constellations. And how to handle that, how to be attentive to those, and how to teach our supervisees about those is powerful. We also talked about legal and ethical issues. Essential, as we mentioned at the beginning, from the contract is the whole informed consent process. And we're pretty attuned to informed consent with our clients, but we see that supervision sometimes is less formal in that way. And we would urge that, in fact, you attend very carefully to the parameters of informed consent for your supervisees. There's a clarity about competence. Of course, our supervisees and ourselves need to be competent, and the whole self-assessment process that we've tried to embed in the entire series is helpful in that. To be aware of areas of lesser competence, for us to be modeling, constantly learning new things and implementing them and bringing them to clinical and supervision practice. Confidentiality is often very complicated because, in fact, there are legal standards, situational standards, personnel practices that limit confidentiality, and ethical standards as well. And it's important for our supervisees to understand the limits of confidentiality, both with their clients and with their supervisors, and what some of the requirements are of supervisors. In fact, that we do hold duty to protect the clients above all else. Then we have documentation. Sometimes documentation is kind of shoved aside, and supervisees perhaps misperceive that it's just terrible work that administration has attached that is heinous. But in fact, documentation serves a critical functions in client care and in supervision, and provides for oversight of the process, provides for continuity of client care, and clarity in conceptualizations. Direct and vicarious liability is always, of course, concern to supervisors and supervisees alike, as well as settings. And that includes all kinds of issues in terms of whether supervisors are, in fact, providing supervision that meets criteria for adequacy, and whether supervisees are informing supervisors of things that occur with their clients. So it's important to be thoughtful that we're not just liable for things we directly do, but also things that our supervisees do under our supervision.
Also talked about countertransference, and reactivity. So the assumption is that in all of our relationships, there's some degree of these kinds of phenomena, that we don't see the other person exactly as they are, that there's always some coloring of our perceptions based on our life experiences. And to the extent that those interfere with our work with our clients and with our supervisees, that's something that we need to help negotiate. And so we talked about helping supervisees recognize that kind of reactivity or countertransference. We're using the terms interchangeably mostly, so that they recognize when, for example, they're having undue irritation toward the client, or undue attraction, or any of the number of other things that interferes with their objectivity. We also then talked about a particular way of approaching that, the critical events model, which we identify a marker. That is, you and the supervisee have concurrence that there's something that's occurred that marks a countertransferential experience, then that there's some intervention that occurs around that. And really the important thing is to help the supervisee feel safe in processing it, and to not feel pathologized, and also not to veer into therapy. We talked about this a lot during the course, that it's important to help supervisees with this, but at the same time not become their therapist. Presumably, by the time you've worked through the sequence, the supervisee has some resolution, is able to return to their treatment with more objectivity. Or if they're not, then we talk about referring them to a personal therapist if, for example, particular kinds of clientele become too difficult for them to work with, and so on. We also talked about direct observation, and this one was challenging, I think, for a lot of folks in the course because of your work settings where it's difficult to do. We talked about several kinds of direct observation. Audio and video recordings are probably the best if you can do that. I think video, both because you can see what's going on and because you can go back and replay it and really do microanalyses of sequences. We also talked about doing live observation. You can do live observation through one-way glass or through camera feeds and so on. And we talked about doing co-therapy as a way of supervising. And we acknowledged that in some of your work settings and some of your clientele, with prisoners, for example, so we talked about some alternatives like role plays.
We also talked about gatekeeping, which is very complicated in your settings. So we had a pretty setting-specific approach to gatekeeping when, in fact, supervisees are not meeting performance criteria. And this does happen. I think many of you have pretty creative ways of helping your supervisees to enhance their competence, whether it be through very directive kinds of work or other kinds of interventions that are specific to your settings. But keeping on your mind at all times that our highest duty is protection of our clients. Therefore, gatekeeping, ensuring that no unsuitable supervisees enter the profession, is essential to supervision practice. We talked about reflective practice and interpersonal process recall, and how critical reflective practice is, even though it seems as though in the speed of things that are going on these days with the many cases and the many responsibilities that supervisors and supervisees share, that sometimes reflection is cast aside. But that reflection is a critical part of clinical supervision. The interpersonal process recall provides techniques to enhance reflective practice and to be thoughtful about many of the things we've already talked about, to highlight what happened at that moment to make you withdraw or to change the subject or all kinds of aspects like that. So to be thoughtful about those complete skill sets that can be complete game changers.
We talked some about models of supervision. Historically, supervisors simply adapted their treatment models. So, until fairly recently, that was the model. So that if you were psychodynamic, you would really adapt your model to supervision and think that way, or CPT and so on. And in fact, those things do inform a lot of how we think about supervision, but more recent models have been very specific to supervision. We talked about two of those. We talked about the integrative developmental model, which really does think about how our supervisees progress in their own cognitive and skill development. And it had dimensions like the degree of autonomy that they experience as they progress, their relationship to the supervisor, and so on. We also talked about the discrimination model, which is really a meta model.
It speaks to the areas on which supervisors can focus, that is, the intervention skills of the supervisee, the way they think about their clients, the conceptual skills, or the personal issues, the personalization skills like countertransference and so on. It also speaks to the kind of role the supervisor might adapt. That is, it could be direct instruction, as in the teacher. It could be a counselor, or more properly, facilitator, or it could be a consultant role.
We also talked about technology and telehealth, and coincidentally, that unit coincided with the beginning of the pandemic. And so in many respects, it was very timely. So we talked about how telehealth is really kind of a broad concept. If you're in contact with clients via phone, that's telehealth. And of course, in the whole range of video conferencing and so on. And in that unit, we talked about some of the issues that come up, including secure communication. How do we assure that? Privacy, doing supervision, or worse, have your supervisee at Starbucks talking about their clients, and that sort of thing. And we also talked about some of the jurisdictional issues. We also talked about some of the legal jurisdictional issues, and those really vary widely by state. But the thing to remember is that licensure is a state-specific matter, so that if your client is in another state and you're seeing that client via Zoom or some other medium, you really need to be mindful of what the legal implications are for that. And in most cases, that's not appropriate unless it's an emergency or some other exception that your state allows you to have. We talked too about using client feedback and supervision. And the data strongly suggests that getting client feedback in a session-by-session way by using one of the established measures reduces dropouts and increases outcomes. So it's really important from a treatment perspective. It's also invaluable in supervision in that it helps signal when there's some problem occurring that you and your supervisee might attend to. It is a blunt instrument. It doesn't tell you what's going wrong or what needs attending to, but it is a signal that that's something that the two of you might be looking through videotapes and so on to really identify what might be going on.
Also speaks to the fact that not all clients are getting better, even though sometimes supervisors and supervisees believe they are. Next is group and triadic supervision. These are very frequent modalities in clinical supervision to conduct a group or a triad, and we were so fortunate to have some leading experts to speak about this. Group supervision is highly complex, and we talked about several models of providing it, the importance of process groups, the importance of ensuring a sense of equity, which is true for triadic as well, to ensure that there's a structure to it so that when you have the two supervisees in triadic or multiple in group, that each supervisee receives their allotted amount of time and attention, and that the group processes are in fact interpreted and addressed directly. Next is self-care. We had a special webinar that hopefully many of you watched on mindfulness. But in addition, we had a wonderful presentation on self-care, on the multitude of research and various practices, and especially in our current era with the incredible stresses on supervisees, clients, and supervisors alike, attending to these processes, being very proactive in them, and perhaps even beginning supervision with a few minutes of mindfulness or centering are such good practices to be self-aware of, because vicarious traumatization, which was the topic of another webinar, is in fact a very real danger, and is critical for supervisors to educate our supervisees about, and to assist our supervisees in, as much as we can, metabolizing and ensuring that the rumination is not going to persist.
Deliberate practice, a fairly new concept. It was first articulated in 1992, and it's mostly been talked about in the context of athletes and musicians. And so we can recognize that the hours and hours of practice on very isolated skills, so that if you're a basketball player, you might practice dribbling over and over again, or shooting free throws. It's fairly new to be thinking about it in the context of professional practice. And we talked about how we as supervisors can help supervisees isolate specific skills and then facilitate their practice to really improve it in a determined way across time. And finally, we talked about case conceptualization. If you refer back to the discrimination model, remember that there are essentially three things you can be focusing on: technical skills and strategies, the kind of the person of the supervisee, and also how they think about cases. And in many respects, this is going on all the time in our work. And in virtually any session, we're thinking in one way or another about the case and how the supervisees work with the client. Chalkboard case conceptualization talked about a particular way of organizing data, and then the importance of doing that at least occasionally in a really systematic way, and not only to help teach about what to look for in the sessions with the client, but also as a matter of helping the supervisee develop increasing levels of cognitive complexity and conceptualization.
The next step now is application. So what we have are 4 different supervision scenarios, and for each one, we'd like you to consider the range of possible competencies that we've just gone over that might pertain. Which of the competencies seem almost certain to be relevant in responding to the situation? Which ones are less certain but possibly relevant, that is, rule-outs? And for those ones to be ruled out, what questions would need to be answered to do that? And then finally, the application part, in employing these supervision competencies that you've identified as relevant to the case, how would you go about using them to intervene? What would be some of the issues to which you would need to attend?
It's been an absolute pleasure to work with all of you in the course of this extended supervision training. And We are so optimistic and so happy that, in fact, so much has occurred, so many changes, and such responsiveness from the group, much of which actually directed some of our course through your feedback. We are hopeful that you will continue this journey, that this will just be the first chapter, and that you will continue to expand your supervision competence, your curiosity about emerging developments, and specific areas that you'd like to explore deeper, that you do that and continue to do that, and perhaps take more of a leadership role, both with your supervisees and with other supervisors in your setting, to ensure that more systematic and intentional supervision practice occurs.
Carol has said it really well, so I think I'll just end at that point and again affirm what a really enriching time this has been for both of us, and I think for most of our team members, as we've learned right alongside you, and really we hope this learning continues. So we hope you take this forward and use it in your work and find ways to support each other as you continue to develop as supervisors.